we have Dennis Parker, who is our first guest
Oh,
in
he's
the
in.
Hangout.
Fantastic.
Yes,
Hello,
he's
Dennis.
in. Yes, he's in. So I'd like to introduce him and get to his segment right away. So Dennis Parker is the director of the National Program. This concentrates on issues of the school to prison pipeline, which funnels children of color from the educational system into the criminal justice system. It also focuses on racial profiling, affirmative action, and economic justice. The Racial Justice Program seeks to remove barriers to equal opportunity for communities of color through litigation, public education, community organizing, and legislation. Prior to joining the ACLU, Dennis was the chief of the Civil Rights Bureau of the Office of the New York State Attorney. He also worked for 14 years at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. He litigated and supervised litigation of many cases involving elementary and secondary education, affirmative action in higher education, and equal education in educational opportunity. Dennis, I'm so happy to have you on our show. Welcome.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Yes, and we have known each other for more than 30 years, maybe even 40 years. I don't even want to go back that far, but we've recently re-encountered each other and we've been playing Scrabble on Facebook, although we haven't played for a while. That's been fun. So I've enjoyed, chatting with you about some of the issues that you're working on. And right now, what you're working on is very much in the news. So before getting to greater issues of the ACLU, all the different programs your organization is working on, as well as your particular division, I would like to talk with you about the Muslim ban, because the ACLU has been in the news recently for leading the fight against that Muslim ban. Can you please describe for us exactly what it was that Donald Trump proposed, what the ACLU saw as wrong with that, how you took action, and where the case stands today?
Well, what Donald Trump signed in his executive order was a ban on people traveling from 7 particular countries, the original way that it was worded and the original way that it was implemented was extremely unclear. And actually, over the first couple of days of the ban, there was a lot of actual chaos that was associated with the rollout of this ban. It wasn't clear whether people who had visas, who had been given visas before, would be allowed to travel. It wasn't clear whether permanent legal residents would be allowed to travel. And what was happening is that people who were coming from these 7 countries were either not being permitted on planes to come to the United States, even if they held valid visas, or once they got here, were not being permitted to enter the country, and in many cases were being sent out. We knew, because of the rhetoric that Trump had used during the campaign, that his goal was to prevent Muslims from coming into the country. And so we knew that something would happen. We weren't sure the exact form that it would take. And when the travel order came out, working together with a number of other groups that are involved in questions of the immigration into the country and national security, we initially, on behalf of 2 people who were coming to the United States through Kennedy Airport, brought a habeas corpus proceeding to release them from the custody of TSA. At the same time, ACLU affiliates throughout the country, and again working with other groups, were preparing cases to file on behalf sometimes of professors who were not being permitted to come into the country, of people who had family members, in some cases people who were themselves citizens or were green card holders, who were expecting family members, and they were not being permitted in. A whole range of different people who were being affected by this really poorly conceived ban, one that was done without consulting anyone, one that was done without making clear to the people who had to make the decisions at the border what would happen. And so there were cases that were filed all over the country. And again, most notably here in New York originally, that challenged the constitutionality of the ban. And they challenged it on a number of bases. One was the Fifth Amendment and the failure of the process to provide due process. But there were also First Amendment um, challenges that were made, and basically saying that this ban, the way that it was being implemented, was done in a way that that violated the First Amendment um, in terms of targeting on the basis of religion people who were seeking to enter the country. And in fact, the administration only made it worse when they added language that made it clear that they would favor people who were being discriminated against on the basis of their religion, but only if their religion was the minority party or was the minority religion in their country, making it clear that, you know, for example, if you had someone coming from Syria who was coming as a refugee, who was coming in order to avoid having themselves killed or family members killed, that if they were Muslim, they would not be eligible for entry into the country. Ostensibly, it was a temporary ban, although the part of the order that dealt with Syria was clearly meant to be permanent. But it was having an enormous impact, and the initial action was to try to stay the ban, to try to keep it from being implemented, and that was successful in New York and a number of other organizations. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, you had a number of states who were adding challenges to the claims that were being made, saying basically that this ban was having an enormous impact on state interests. And it was those cases that went up to the Ninth Circuit. Trump tried to get the stay that a Seattle judge entered set aside, failed at the district court level, went to the Court of Appeals, and then ultimately got the order that came in on Friday. And it's important to recognize that the Ninth Circuit decision doesn't finally decide the question of the constitutionality of the travel ban. But what it does is it makes clear that this is something that the courts can review. Trump has been, or the administration has been, making the argument that this is purely an executive prerogative that isn't overseen by the courts, and the court rejected that pretty clearly. It was also clear that the court was disturbed by the absence of any allegations of harm to the government if the stay is permitted to continue. At the same time, it recognized that there was enormous harm to a whole range of people and to the states. And I think it was significant, and they recognized the right of states to challenge these kind of orders on behalf of their citizens, on behalf of the businesses in the states, on behalf of educational institutions in the states. So it's given them the authority and the power to challenge these. What will
Okay,
happen?
well, okay, I'm sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say what will happen next is uncertain. There will be discovery in the cases. Ultimately, the courts will have to decide the larger issue of whether or not the order as it's written is constitutional or unconstitutional.
Yes, I was going to ask, I've been listening to some of the and there's some question about whether Trump is going to go back to the Ninth Circuit Court with a revised order, or whether he's going to take this up to the Supreme Court. What are your thoughts on that?
It's going to be very difficult either way. He could be trying to go to the Ninth Circuit to ask for an en banc review, which would be a review by all of the judges rather than just the three who decided the decision on Friday. He could seek to go directly to the Supreme Court. But the problem that he's going to face in either instance is the problem that the Ninth Circuit identified, which is they have not identified any harms. They have not identified, they're making these broad claims about terrorists coming in, but there's no evidence that supports that. And so wherever he goes, he's going to have to deal with that lack of evidence. Added to that is, of course,
Yes.
that the Supreme Court now only has 8 members.
Yes.
And it is unlikely he would be able to get a majority of those 8. And if it splits 4-4, then it just affirms the lower court decision.
Well, it's very interesting because, as you know, Trump communicates mostly through tweeting, and he tweeted that he was very disappointed with the decision, that it was political, that the judges are political. And there was also a story in Raw story about how he's getting very frustrated with being president because he's finding that he cannot boss around all these different branches of government the same way that he could boss around the employees of his privately held business, and that he really wants to spend more time playing golf down in Palm Beach. So it's interesting to see how long he's going to last in there. Before we get into talking a little bit about the ACLU, and I don't know if this is your area, but just real quickly, do you think there are grounds to impeach him and that this could happen?
It's not my area, but I think that, at the rate that he is doing outrageous things, I think it's just a matter of time, whether it's something dealing with his financial interests in self-dealing, or, any of the other things that he is proposing. He has done one thing after another, which is unprecedented. And I think the other good thing that comes out of what's happened with the order is it's a reaffirmation of the separation of powers, something which he has not demonstrated any understanding of.
Exactly.
And so perhaps, perhaps there will be grounds for impeachment.
Okay, so I want to pivot over to the ACLU, because what's the other good thing that's come out of this is that the ACLU has received $79 million in contributions. And in preparing for this interview, I was perusing the website and reading some of the press releases, and ambitious plan to use that $79 million. Can you tell us first briefly all the issue areas that the ACLU covers and what you plan to do with this money?
Yes, I mean, there are a wide range of issues and issues that we covered long before Trump got involved. And, most notably, we're known for our work on free speech. We anticipate that there will be a lot of work in terms of protecting the rights of protesters to engage in free speech. We've dealt with government surveillance. We have programs that do immigration work, that do LGBT work, women's rights, and particularly reproductive freedom. We have a voting rights section, one that specializes in criminal law reform, and one that my program, the Racial Justice Program, works very closely with. As I don't remember whether I mentioned disability, but these are all separate sections, but we work together, and have been involved in a lot of issues. We have all been considering what possible impact this administration will have, trying to anticipate in advance what he's going to do. And I think one sign of that is that the case challenging the order, the executive order dealing with the travel ban, was filed the same day that the executive order came out. And part of that is because we knew he'd be doing something. We didn't know exactly what it was, but this possibility was one of the ones that we recognized was a possibility. So there was some level of preparation. And as surprising as he is, we have some idea of where he's going to be going, and we've been looking at it. And one other thing that I should have mentioned before that is going to be very important, that in the wake of the order, each of the affiliates filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get information about how many people were affected by the executive order, to get a sense of who are potential plaintiffs, who suffered, and the scope of the program. So that kind of work, doing Freedom of Information Act requests, have long been a part of the ACLU's work.
To what you're going to do with the new money, as was written about in the press release.
There's a combination of things. There will be staff that is hired to do litigation. There will be advocacy staff. A lot of what's going to be happening over the next 4 years, a lot of it will be at the federal level, but a lot of it will be at the state level. And so it's important that we keep track of and work with each of our affiliates in each state to try to assure that things aren't happening there that will compromise people's constitutional rights. There's a lot of data that will have to be analyzed. We have to remain nimble, which means doing the kinds of things that we've done, challenging quickly the actions that are being taken. So there will be a significant amount of hiring. There'll be people who will be doing data analysis. There will be people who will be meeting with all of the groups on the ground that are engaged in the struggle with us. And so there is, it is obviously a large amount of resources, but there's a lot of work that's going to have to be done. And we're glad that we're getting the assistance, and we're glad that other organizations are also getting more money to do the work, because one of the things that will have to happen in the next 4 years is that organizations like ours will have to step in to even do the things that the federal government used to do, even if not always well. So for example, one of the issues that my group and some of the other groups work on deals with police misconduct. And the Justice Department had done some reviews of some police departments in Chicago, in Baltimore, had entered into agreements with them. It is doubtful that this administration will monitor those agreements. It's doubtful that this administration will investigate police departments the way that had been done in the past. So it's important that other groups be there to do that, and that's one of the things we'll be doing.
Yes, well, it's interesting because Truth Out just wrote an article that I shared with you about Trump's new executive order on policing, and they're titling their article, "Trump Declares Racialized War on Dissent," and basically say the overriding theme of the order is, quote, "to develop strategies led by the Department of Justice to further enhance the protection and safety of federal, state, tribal, and local law enforcement," unquote. And what they're saying is, what comes to mind is the cops that were killed in the line of duty, the shooting in Dallas being the most prominent example. But the policy statement, either explicitly or implicitly, appeals to fears about people of color and the demonization of the Black Lives Matter movement, resonating with the barely coded racist refrains of Blue Lives Matter and Law and Order. He then says, the order at bottom takes aims at protesters, most urgently the water protectors at Standing Rock, BLM protesters across the nation, people protesting the Muslim ban, and many others who practice acts of civil disobedience that bring them into conflict with law enforcement. Not content with local prosecutors dealing with these confrontations, this order encourages Sessions and his Department of Justice to find more punitive federal laws to charge protesters, to seek the passage of new federal laws to further aid this effort, and to seek new mandatory minimum sentences to enhance punishment of under the guise of protecting law enforcement from violence. And it directs the Department of Justice to work with other federal agencies to develop an executive strategy to prevent violence against federal, state, tribal, and local law enforcement officers, unquote. And then he likens this to COINTELPRO. So this is a very much concern to the viewers of my show, because our show is called, obviously, The Robust Opposition, and one of the biggest tools of opposition is protest. So what do you think of this executive law? Is the ACLU planning to challenge this as well? And do you think that it would be enforceable?
The executive order, as it's written, is remarkably unspecific. So at this point, challenging it in the form it is now would be difficult. But we are very, very worried about it, and we do think that there are a whole range of fears. At a very basic level, one of the things that it does is it like so much of what Trump does is designed to play on a fear about, number one, violence against law enforcement, and also a fear about crime levels, which is just not based on anything. And I think it is correct that there is a real fear that this is directed at groups like Black Lives Matter, trying to shift the emphasis on misconduct of police officers back to this supposed war on police officers. What we are doing is monitoring very carefully, and one of the immediate things that's happening is in a number of states there is legislation being proposed that would, in essence, make it a crime to engage in protest, and that's something that is a huge concern and a major priority of the ACLU. It has long been one of our mottos that dissent is patriotic, and that's something that we have fought to protect for a long time. So we're monitoring what's going on in the states. We're monitoring what's going on in the federal government. We have long been involved, for example, in efforts to fight back against the militarization of police departments. In Ferguson, we're involved in lawsuits. We have been involved in organizing groups in Washington, D.C. to push back to the grant programs that provided police departments with tanks and with armor and things that are more appropriate for a war zone than for cities. We fully expect that there will be more rather than fewer of those things. And, we are again gearing up to challenge those once they try to operationalize it.
Yes, and you just had a victory in a case where you were defending mental protesters who were being sued for defamation because they were protesting a coal ash facility. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it was a remarkable and shocking case, and although it wasn't against the government, I think it is symptomatic of an attempt to try to stifle speech. This is a poor Black community in Uniontown, Alabama, that was the site of a dump for coal ash, which had been produced in Tennessee. There had been a major environmental disaster in Tennessee when the coal ash, which has arsenic and a lot of poisonous substances in it, was leaking out into the water system. And the EPA required that in Tennessee that coal ash be sent elsewhere. And of course, where it was sent was to this poor Black community in Alabama, where it was being dumped in basically open air facilities. And the community started to organize and to form a group. They created a Facebook page. They pushed back and talked about the impact that the dumping of the coal ash was having on their community. And the company that was responsible for dumping the ash proceeded to sue them for $40 million for defamation and for libel, because they said that they were misstating the impact of the coal ash. And so we were put in an unusual position for us. We generally bring lawsuits, but in this case, we thought it was important to defend the community group that was speaking out against the dumping. And we showed that we became their lawyers along with some other groups, and a law firm. And we demonstrated that what they were doing was fully within the First Amendment, that this was an attempt to have a chilling effect on speech, and ultimately entered into an agreement that withdrew the case, and that limited the actions that this company could take against these people. And it was a particularly frightening case because it was in essence a community saying, we don't want to be poisoned, this is a health hazard, and then being told, we're going to ask for $40 million from you poor people because of the fact that you are protesting.
Yes, and this is very much similar to the actions of the states who are going around trying to ban fracking bans, when local communities try to rise up and say, we don't want this in our community, and they go through all the trouble to pass fracking bans. Then the state passes legislation, probably written by ALEC, that basically says fracking bans are illegal. Or, you know, what's happening in Michigan and other states with the emergency manager laws, where they bring in these business people who supposedly are better fiscal management to override the will of the local council. Now, we are at the end of our program, our allotted time. We have not had a chance to get into your division, which I want to do. So I want to ask you and Dave if we can go an additional 15 minutes. Do you both have the time to do that?
I do.
Okay, great. So let's pivot over into the program that you direct. Now, I look at it online and I see that there's 5 major areas: race and criminal justice, race and economic justice, race and inequality in education, affirmative action, and American Indian rights. I wonder if you could just briefly sum up what each of those areas focuses on, and then maybe we can take some time to talk about 2 cases that you're working on that you find particularly important.
Sure. In the education area, we're working primarily on trying to end the school to prison pipeline, which is the mechanism, policies, and practices which push children out of the education system into the juvenile or criminal justice systems through disciplinary practices mostly that are unfair and discriminatory, that have a particularly strong impact on children of color. And one of the cases that I'll talk about later deals with that specifically. In the criminal justice area, we've been concentrating mostly on 2 things. One is racial profiling and ethnic profiling. We've been doing some work about identification of South Asian people on planes, but also, of course, street stops and frisks, particularly of Black and Latino people, by police departments. We've also been working in that area very heavily on debtors' prisons, which are practices under which people who are indigent are being jailed because of their indigency, because they can't afford to pay fines and fees. You know, specifically, you get a parking ticket, you can't pay it. They start adding fees. Soon you owe $2,000, and the next thing you know, you're being sentenced to jail because you can't pay that, even though it's not a criminal offense, and even though you have no money. So that's one thing we're working on. We are affirmative action is an ongoing thing, pushing back against attempts to ban the consideration of race in government decision making, and you know, that's something that's ongoing. We are working to create educational opportunities, both by trying to break up racial and ethnic and isolation in schools. As you know, the American schools are in many ways more segregated now than they were 30 or 40 years ago. Trying to create access to more resources for schools. We are doing a number of housing cases dealing with predatory lending, and particularly things like our biggest case now is the case against Morgan Stanley for the impact that its securitization practices had on Detroit Black homeowners who were given mortgages that were almost certain to foreclose and are now facing being driven out of their homes by practices that made money for Morgan Stanley.
Dennis,
Yes.
I just want to interrupt you because I'm hearing a scratching sound and it's maybe coming out of your end. I don't know if our viewers are hearing it, but if you're moving, you can talk. We'll edit this out.
Okay, I may be moving, and that may be part of it. We are looking more about internet discrimination and both looking at the government's role in it. We have a challenge to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act on the grounds that it essentially criminalizes behavior that we think is important for fighting back against discrimination. And specifically what I mean is that we are representing people who want to test online housing and lending to determine whether or not there is discrimination going on the basis of race and ethnicity. In order to do that, you have to create profiles that are not real. Those violate terms of services of various platforms. And this law makes it illegal to do that and can result in criminal prosecution. We have been involved in discussions with Airbnb and Facebook about some of their policies, which potentially have a discriminatory impact. And we're actually very pleased that recently Facebook changed its advertising policy, which permitted advertisers to target their advertisements based on racial affinity. And there are concerns that you could, if you were advertising housing, just target certain groups and exclude others. And in general, we are concerned about the criminalization of poverty, not only the debtor's prison work that I was looking at, but for instance, practices like district attorney's offices that work as collection agencies now for credit card companies. So a district attorney will write to someone and suggest that they will be criminally prosecuted for not paying their Visa bill. And that is not a proper function for the government. So
yes, I want to ask about that because I remember in all the coverage of Ferguson and whatnot, I was appalled to find out that some of these parking ticket fines that are maybe, $50, people end up paying over $3,000 because they never can pay off the original fine, and they keep adding penalties and interest, and it's usurious, just like these these payday lenders and these check cashing places. And like you say, the governments are basically the local governments are balancing their books on the back of the poor people, similar to the fact that, a parking ticket in Los Angeles is like $62. And that mostly affects working people who are coming in to, do deliveries or whatever they're doing. And it's because the top 1% isn't paying their fair share. There's just so much inequality, as you say. And I'm just wondering how much of this really can be attacked. And then, of course, I covered the NAACP hearing the other day. They're holding hearings around the country regarding their call for a moratorium on charter schools. And I know that you think some of those charter schools are good, but basically the overall effect of charter schools, I think, is to increase segregation and also to defund public education, because the money follows the child. And if the child leaves the public school system and goes into a charter, then that is defunding of the public schools. So I'm wondering what you have that. I know I mentioned a couple of things in there, but whatever sparks your interest.
Sure. I mean, first of all, the comment about Ferguson is correct, and that's an example of one of the important things that, you know, again, we all have questions about whether or not the Justice Department did enough before. But one of the important things that came out of the Justice Department study of Ferguson was this idea that there are municipalities all over the country that are balancing their budgets by fining and fining people for these minor offenses. And they target communities of color. They target the poorest people, the people who are most vulnerable. And so that is an enormous problem. In many cases, we had a case in Georgia where the collection was then contracted out to a private company that was compensated for collecting by being permitted to add on to the fines that are owed, so that we had a case where if someone could only afford $20 a month to pay off their $3,000 fee that they owed, the first $18 of it would go to the private probation company, so that the amount that they owed would only go down $2 a month, which means essentially they would owe money for life.
Did you win that case? Did you win that case? Because that sounds like an important
case.
Yes.
We did, and we are actually doing well in Mississippi and some other places, Washington State, where we are challenging some of these debtors' prison practices, and that interestingly is an area where we've seen advances, even sometimes the threat of litigation, or sometimes demonstrating to people why this is bad policy, has resulted in changes in a statewide practice. We have actually sued both voucher programs, one in Milwaukee, and charter schools, where we believe that the activities that they've been doing have either furthered segregation or have discriminated against people, particularly disabled students. And that's something that we are concerned about. So although we have not formally taken a position on charters, we believe that they do have to comply with the applicable federal laws. We think it's important to make sure that they're not implemented in a way that is discriminatory, either by excluding disabled students or segregating schools. And you know, most importantly, that public education has a requirement to educate all students. You know, I would point out.
Yes, now you might have noticed that Betsy DeVos, one of the first things that she has done is removed the page that talks about IDEA, which is the law for disabled students. And friends of mine at a group called Badass Teachers Association, which you do not have to be a teacher to join. I'm a member. It was a Facebook group that has last time I looked, over 60,000 members. And they're teachers that actually feel in many cases that their unions do not go far enough in protecting them. So they have taken action. They're a 501c3. They go down to Washington and lobby their senators and congressmen. They had a great three-phase plan of action against Betsy DeVos. Unfortunately, they did not win their ultimate goal, which is to deny her confirmation. But their plan right now is to go to all the Republican senators who voted for her and hold town halls. And if the senators won't hold the town hall, they're going to hold them and have an empty seat. This is all part of the resistance. But she most recently posted this very disturbing news about IDEA. And as a mom who had a son who took advantage of that, my son had an IEP all through elementary and high school. And the school district provided wonderful assistance for him. I'm very concerned about what they're trying to do. And I'm wondering if you have this on your radar, if you've been following this, and what your next step is going to be.
It is very much on our radar, and we've been monitoring the Department of Education site, both for questions about disability and also for questions about school discipline. One of the things that had happened in the Justice Department and the Education Department over the past 2 or 3 years is a concern that is one of our central areas of a concern about the dangers that are associated with police in schools, and how that has resulted in far more children being arrested for conduct which is not criminal. And actually, if you don't mind, if I could talk about one of the cases that I think is important, that
Yes, I'd
ties
like
in
to.
with that.
Yes, I'd like to end on that. I was going to ask you what you thought your most important case was that you've ever done, but if you want to close on this case, I'm happy to hear about it.
Well, it's a case that in South Carolina that's a challenge to what's called a disturbing school statute. And what that is a statute that some 23 states in the country have, which make it criminal to disturb schools. And the definition of disturbing schools is really broad. It includes things like, behaving in an obnoxious fashion, which any of us who've had teenagers know makes basically every teenager a criminal. And this case, we happen to be looking nationwide at this issue because we're concerned at the huge number of Black students and brown students who are being suspended and expelled from schools, but more importantly, are being arrested and charged with crimes for behavior that when I was growing up would have got you sent to the principal's office. Now you get sent to jail. And the impact that has on the community of color is enormous. It increases dropouts. It makes it impossible to get loans later on. It makes it hard to get jobs. It feeds into that whole criminal justice system that Michelle Alexander wrote about so convincingly. We are representing in South Carolina one of the girls. You remember there was a video about a year and a half ago of a school resource officer physically throwing a girl out of her chair and throwing her across a room. And that video was shown all over the country. We are representing a student who was in the class who spoke to the teacher and to the other students and said, they can't do this, this has to stop. She was then arrested and charged with a crime for saying that. And so we are hoping that we can use this as a way of trying to make sure we can keep kids in schools. We can avoid having them charged with crimes. We can not, encourage that students be targeted and basically silenced. It is a case that may eventually have a very broad impact. The other area that we have been very successful. Sometimes you can get a lot not by litigating, but by doing reports. We had done an investigation of stops and frisks in Boston, and we're very pleased when there was a decision coming from the highest court in Massachusetts, which dealt with a Black man who was arrested because he was running away from the police. And the court, citing our report, said it is actually reasonable for a Black person to be fearful of the police and reasonable for them to run away. And recognizing that is an important step in dealing. We did stop and frisk cases with other groups here in New York City, which have made some changes in policies, and those are important cases. These immigration cases are important. It's hard to identify just one, but we'll be continuing them. Unfortunately, a lot of what we're going to be doing is trying to hold on to advances we've gotten and not lose in that struggle. But I think, we still have our long-term goals in mind, and we're hopeful that we can get past this immediate time and get back to the business of trying to bring some question of equality and fairness into American life.
Well, that's great. And even though the right wing has tried to use this as an insult, I'm proud to be a card-carrying member of the ACLU. And I want to direct my viewers to your website, www.aclu.org. There is certainly no reason why you can't give this organization even more money, even though they've just raised $79 million. Thank you, Dennis, for being on our show, for all your great work. I hope to have you back sometime soon.
My pleasure. Good to speak to you. Take care.
Okay.